There's a moment every single morning, somewhere between your alarm going off and your feet hitting the floor, when your body makes a decision you never voted on. Not a dramatic one, not one your doctor will bring up at your next checkup, but a real, measurable, biological decision about whether the next 16 hours lean toward repair or toward decline. Most Americans live their entire lives without ever knowing that moment exists. And here's the thing. It has almost nothing to do with your genes. Large studies on identical twins show genetics account for only a modest share of how long and how well people live. The rest, the majority, comes down to behavior. Ordinary, repeatable behavior inside ordinary days. So instead of handing you a list of warnings, we're going to walk through a single day, a completely average American day. And at each hour, we'll stop on something your body is quietly doing that almost nobody is ever taught to notice. By the end, you may look at your morning coffee, your afternoon silence, and your bedtime a little differently. Because here's the real question worth sitting with before we begin. What if the most important health decisions of your life aren't the big dramatic ones, the surgeries, the diagnoses, the prescriptions, but the small, invisible ones, repeated thousands of times, that you've never once thought of as decisions at all? Let's start where the day starts, with waking up. The instant you open your eyes, your body has already gone 6, 7, maybe 8 hours without a single sip of water. You've been losing moisture all night just by breathing, by sweating faintly under the blankets, by the basic fact of being alive. Every human wakes up mildly dehydrated. That's normal. What changes as we age is how the body handles that deficit, and most people have no idea this shift is even happening. Here's what rarely gets explained outside of a medical textbook. As people move through their 60s, 70s, and 80s, the kidneys gradually become less efficient at holding onto water. At the very same time, the brain's thirst signal, that reliable little alarm that used to say, "Drink something," grows fainter. Sometimes it stops showing up altogether. Think about what that actually means in practice. A 25-year-old who skips water for half a day feels an urgent, unmistakable thirst. A 78-year-old in the exact same state of mild dehydration might feel nothing specific at all, just a vague tiredness, some irritability, maybe a headache they blame on stress. The warning light is still wired into the dashboard. It's just dimmer. And it's easy to drive right past it without realizing the tank is running low. This is one of the most under-recognized reasons older adults end up in American emergency rooms, not from a dramatic illness, but from a slow, accumulating fluid deficit that nobody, including the person experiencing it, ever clearly identified. Geriatric clinicians see a specific pattern often enough to take it seriously. Sudden confusion, disorientation, or unusual irritability in an older adult that traces back to nothing more exotic than not drinking enough water, sometimes combined with a urinary tract infection, which itself becomes more likely when the body is running dry. Families often fear the worst, wondering if this is the beginning of dementia. In a meaningful number of cases, it isn't. It's a reversible, fixable problem, wearing the costume of something much scarier. That's why any sudden change in an older adult's mental clarity deserves prompt medical attention, not to be quietly written off as just getting older. There's an even deeper layer here. When the body runs persistently low on fluid, blood volume drops slightly, blood thickens marginally, and certain inflammatory pathways quietly switch on. Inflammation that simmers for years rather than flaring and resolving the way it's supposed to has been linked in substantial research to accelerated vascular aging, more brittle blood vessels, and added burden on both the heart and brain. A glass of water isn't a cure for any of this, but it does reframe something important. In later life, hydration can't rely on thirst anymore. because thirst itself has become an unreliable narrator. It requires building an external structure, a habit that doesn't wait for a signal that may not reliably show up. Some geriatric specialists recommend detaching hydration from thirst entirely. A glass of water immediately upon waking, before coffee, before the phone, before anything. A glass with each meal, using meals as dependable anchor points. And the simplest feedback signal of all. Pale urine means you're on track. Dark urine means you're behind. One important note. Fluid needs are not one size fits all. People managing heart failure, certain kidney conditions, or those taking diuretics often need individualized guidance from their physician, sometimes guidance that runs in the opposite direction of drink more. This is exactly the kind of detail worth raising directly with your doctor, rather than assuming a generic rule applies to you. But for most people, that first glass of water, or the absence of it, is decision number one. Almost immediately after, usually within the same hour, comes decision number two. One most Americans make without a second thought: when exactly to eat that first bite of food. For most of human history, the first meal of the day didn't happen the moment someone woke up. Food was scarce. You worked for it. You waited for it. Eating within minutes of opening your eyes would have been an impossible luxury. Today, for millions of Americans, the first calories of the day arrive before their feet have left the bed. And there's a quiet biological cost to that shift that researchers are still working to fully understand. Inside nearly every cell in your body, there's a process running in the background called autophagy, a Greek term that roughly translates to self-eating. It sounds alarming. It's actually one of the most elegant maintenance systems your biology runs. During stretches without incoming food, cells begin clearing out damaged proteins, worn-out components, and internal debris that accumulates just from the ordinary business of living. It's less like eating yourself, and more like a building inspection that quietly removes faulty wiring before it causes a real fire. This process was considered fairly obscure until 2016, when Japanese cell biologist Yoshinori Ohsumi won the Nobel Prize in Physiology specifically for mapping out how it works. That recognition didn't come from nowhere. The deeper scientists looked, the more central this cellular cleanup turned out to be to how cells age, and how they sometimes go wrong in ways connected to cancer, neurodegeneration, and metabolic disease. Here's the part that matters for how you structure an ordinary day. This cleanup activity tends to be highest when the body has gone a meaningful stretch without food, and it tends to get suppressed the moment eating begins. So a pattern of eating across 15 or 16 waking hours leaves very little daily window for that maintenance process to run uninterrupted. Now, this needs to be said carefully, because enthusiasm in this space has sometimes outpaced the evidence. Much of the most detailed data on autophagy comes from animal studies and isolated cells. Human research is still catching up. But controlled studies on time-restricted eating, compressing meals into a more consistent daily window, not starving, have shown modest but real improvements in blood pressure and blood sugar regulation in some populations, including older adults, even without cutting calories. This isn't dramatic fasting. Nobody is suggesting skipping meals. The research generally points towards something gentler, delaying the first meal by an hour or two after waking, and finishing the last meal a few hours before bed. For most people, that naturally creates an overnight window of roughly 12 to 14 hours without food. That's not extreme. For most of human history, it was just called not eating in the middle of the night. In practice, this rarely comes down to willpower at the dinner table. It's the unconscious snack while scrolling your phone an hour before bed. The second cup of something sweet poured out of habit rather than hunger.
The eating window quietly stretching wider over years without anyone ever deciding it should. Just noticing where your day's first and last bites actually fall, without judgment, is often the most useful first step. Most people have genuinely never timed it. One genuine caveat worth naming plainly. Older adults face a separate challenge we'll come to in a moment, where muscles become less efficient at using protein.
That makes adequate, well-distributed protein intake especially important, and means compressing eating windows is not the right move for everyone. Anyone managing diabetes, taking medications timed around meals, or with any history of disordered eating should treat this as a topic for their doctor or a registered dietitian, not a rule to self-apply. By midday, something is happening inside nearly every older American body that produces no pain, no symptom, no obvious signal, and yet may be one of the most consequential processes in the entire aging story. It's called sarcopenia, and it simply means the gradual, progressive loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength that comes with age. It starts earlier than most people think. Research consistently shows the average adult begins losing measurable muscle mass around age 30, at roughly 3 to 8% per decade in those who remain largely inactive. That sounds small until you multiply it across 40 or 50 years. After 60, in people doing nothing specific to counteract it, the pace accelerates. Some studies estimate that a meaningful proportion of adults over 60 already show measurable sarcopenia, and the number climbs sharply with each additional decade, reaching roughly half of people in their 80s.
To understand why this matters so much, stop thinking of muscle as simply what lets you carry groceries or climb stairs. Physiologists increasingly describe it as a metabolic organ in its own right. Skeletal muscle is the single largest site in the body for clearing glucose out of the bloodstream after a meal. Less muscle means a reduced capacity to manage blood sugar efficiently, which is part of why muscle loss and type 2 diabetes so often appear together in the research. And there's another layer uncovered more recently. When a muscle contracts, whether from a walk, a set of squats, or simply standing up from a chair, it releases signaling molecules called myokines into the bloodstream. These molecules appear to have wide-ranging effects throughout the body, including anti-inflammatory properties. Researchers sometimes describe contracting muscle as functioning like an internal pharmacy, releasing beneficial compounds simply through movement.
Here's where decades of well-meaning American health advice may have pointed people in the wrong direction. For a long time, the conventional wisdom for older adults was, take it easy, avoid strain, stick to gentle walking and light stretching. And while walking has real value, that advice left out something crucial. The specific stimulus that tells aging muscle to maintain or rebuild itself is resistance, not just movement in general. Some of the most striking research on this comes from studies on frail adults in their 80s and 90s who participated in structured strength training programs, including early landmark trials conducted in nursing home settings. These studies found that even very old, very frail participants could build meaningful new muscle strength. The capacity to adapt doesn't disappear with age. It diminishes, but it doesn't disappear. And that is a genuinely hopeful finding that hasn't reached nearly enough American living rooms. There's a second piece that explains why many older adults who do eat reasonably well still lose muscle anyway. Research published in nutrition journals found that older muscle requires a noticeably larger single dose of protein, often estimated somewhere between 25 and 40 grams, to trigger the same muscle-building response that a smaller amount would trigger in someone decades younger. Spread protein too thinly across the day, a few grams here, a little more there, and the signal may never reach the threshold needed to prompt repair. Major nutrition research groups studying aging
generally recommend that healthy older adults aim for higher daily protein than the standard general guideline, which was designed primarily to prevent outright deficiency, not to support aging muscle. Active older adults often need more still.
This is a conversation worth having with a healthcare provider, particularly for anyone managing kidney disease. But the broader research pattern is consistent. Many older Americans are eating close to the bare minimum protein when their biology is asking for considerably more. The real-world consequence rarely shows up as a diagnosis. It shows up quietly. A grocery bag that suddenly feels heavier than it used to. A flight of stairs that requires a pause halfway up. A fall on a perfectly ordinary sidewalk that wouldn't have happened 5 years earlier. Falls are one of the leading causes of injury among older Americans, and strength, balance, and muscle mass are among the most modifiable factors influencing whether a stumble becomes a minor inconvenience or a hospital admission. The encouraging news deserves real emphasis. Skeletal muscle responds to intervention better than almost anything else on this list. You don't need a gym membership. Body weight movements, resistance bands, or simply rising from a chair with full control, repeated regularly and challenged progressively, can meaningfully change this trajectory at any age. There's also value in movement that never gets labeled as exercise at all. Research on what's sometimes called non-exercise activity, the cumulative effect of standing up, walking across a room, doing light chores, gardening, found that simply breaking up long stretches of sitting every 30 to 60 minutes measurably improves blood sugar regulation, independent of whether someone also works out that day. The goal doesn't have to be a gym routine starting tomorrow. It can simply be less uninterrupted sitting. One more fact worth knowing. Grip strength, tested with a small handheld device, has turned out in large international research, including one widely cited study following nearly 140,000 adults across 17 countries, to predict the risk of death from any cause more accurately than systolic blood pressure. A weak handshake carries more genuine prognostic weight than one of the most familiar numbers in all of American medicine. Picture an ordinary American afternoon. Hours pass with very little real human contact. A few notifications, a text or two, but no actual conversation, no voice, no shared presence in a room. For a growing number of older adults in this country, that's not an occasional afternoon. That's most afternoons. What researchers have found about this pattern is, frankly, startling, and far more rigorously documented than most people realize. One comprehensive analysis pooled data from 148 separate studies involving more than 300,000 participants, tracked over an average follow-up period of roughly 7.5 years. The finding? People with stronger social relationships had about 50% greater odds of still being alive at the end of the follow-up period compared to those with weaker connections. Researchers have publicly compared the magnitude of this effect to smoking a substantial number of cigarettes daily. That comparison lands in a way raw statistics rarely do, because American public health culture treats smoking as an obvious danger and loneliness as simply an unfortunate feeling. Why does this risk concentrate so heavily in later life? It has less to do with personality and more to do with the sheer number of social exits that cluster into the same few decades. Retirement removes a daily structure of colleagues and conversation that often went unappreciated until it was gone. Widowhood removes a primary confidant, sometimes after 50 or 60 years of shared daily life. Adult children move for work. Old friends, by statistical reality, begin to pass away. In many parts of America, losing the ability to drive quietly shrinks a person's world down to whatever is within walking distance and whoever is willing to provide a ride. None of this happens because someone failed to plan well enough.
It's simply what later life tends to look like in modern American society.
Which is exactly why social connection at this stage often needs to be actively rebuilt, rather than assumed to continue on its own. To understand why isolation carries this much biological weight, think about how deeply social connection is wired into human physiology. For most of human evolutionary history, separation from the group was genuinely dangerous, a real threat to survival. The nervous system still treats prolonged loneliness somewhat like a low-grade emergency. Stress hormones, particularly cortisol, tend to run higher and more persistently in chronically lonely people. That sustained elevation has been associated in research with increased systemic inflammation, added strain on the cardiovascular system, and a higher incidence of cognitive decline in long-term observational studies. The reach extends even to physical healing.
Research on stress and immune function has found that wounds heal measurably more slowly under conditions of high stress and low social support, and that immune responses to things like vaccines can be measurably weaker as well. The body doesn't fully separate emotional state from physical repair capacity. In 2023, the United States Surgeon General issued a formal advisory treating loneliness as a genuine public health crisis, not simply an unfortunate but unavoidable feature of getting older. One important nuance worth pausing on: living alone and feeling lonely are not the same thing. Some people who live entirely by themselves report feeling deeply connected through regular calls, visits, and community involvement, and appear to carry little of the added risk. Meanwhile, some people surrounded by family still report intense loneliness, with biological stress markers to match.
It seems to be less about the number of people physically nearby, and more about the felt quality and frequency of genuine connection. This also explains why passive scrolling hasn't shown the same protective effect that active reciprocal contact has. Some studies have even found heavier passive social media use associated with greater reported loneliness, particularly in older users. The nervous system responds to the texture of real exchange, a shared task, a real-time conversation, a recognized voice, in ways that one-directional observation simply doesn't replicate. What tends to help, according to the research, isn't complicated. Regular voice or in-person contact, ideally several times a week. Shared activity-based connection, a class, a volunteer commitment, a faith community, a recurring meetup, where conversation happens naturally around something else rather than being the forced entire point of the interaction. It's not about manufacturing constant socializing. It's about making sure genuine connection happens often enough that the nervous system isn't quietly interpreting daily life as a threat. As the afternoon gives way to evening, all of this, the hydration, the meal timing, the movement or lack of it, the company or its absence, feeds into what may be the single most underestimated repair window in the entire 24-hour cycle: sleep. There's a deeply ingrained American belief that more sleep is always better. That if 7 hours feels good, 9 must feel even better. That an extra hour in bed is essentially a gift to your body. The actual research tells a more complicated story, one shaped distinctly like the letter U rather than a straight downward line. Large pooled analyses following well over 1 million participants combined have found that both shorter and longer sleep durations are associated with a higher risk of death compared to sleeping roughly 7 to 8 hours a night. In some of this research, habitually sleeping more than 8 or 9 hours has been associated with roughly a 30% higher relative risk of all-cause mortality compared to that middle range. Separate analyses focused on stroke found long sleep duration associated with notably elevated risk of both occurrence and stroke-related death. Short sleep carries elevated risk too. The lowest risk in most studies clusters consistently around that 7 to 8 hour range, a narrower target than most people assume.
It's important to interpret this carefully. A statistical association is not a guaranteed personal outcome. Some portion of the long sleep finding likely reflects something else entirely: depression, undiagnosed sleep apnea, early-stage illness, conditions that independently cause people to spend more time in bed. That means extended sleep duration may sometimes be a marker of an underlying issue rather than a direct cause of harm on its own.
This is the kind of pattern that deserves a conversation with a physician, particularly for anyone whose sleep needs have shifted noticeably and unexpectedly. Sleep apnea deserves particular attention here because it's both common and frequently missed in older Americans. It involves repeated brief pauses in breathing throughout the night, often accompanied by loud snoring, that fragments sleep without the person remembering any of it the next morning. Its hallmark daytime symptom, persistent fatigue, is so easily mistaken for an inevitable part of aging that it often goes undiagnosed for years. Anyone experiencing loud snoring, witnessed pauses in breathing, or unexplained daytime sleepiness despite adequate hours in bed has good reason to raise it with a doctor. It's one of the most common, most correctable contributors to poor sleep quality in later life. There's a clear biological explanation for why simply spending more time in bed doesn't automatically mean more rest as we age. Sleep architecture changes substantially over the decades. Deep, slow-wave sleep, the most physically restorative stage, becomes measurably less prominent with advancing age, while nighttime awakenings become more frequent. An older adult spending 9 or 10 hours in bed may, in reality, be accumulating far less genuinely restorative sleep than those hours suggest, cycling instead through lighter, more fragmented stages. This connects directly to the body's master timekeeping system, the circadian rhythm, regulated by a small cluster of cells deep in the brain that responds powerfully to light exposure. Irregular sleep timing, excessive time spent in dim indoor light, and inconsistent wake times can all gradually blur the clarity of that signal, making both falling asleep and staying asleep less efficient. One of the most accessible, well-supported tools for keeping that internal clock calibrated: morning light exposure. Ideally within the first 30 minutes or so after waking. Even modest, bright natural light shortly after rising has been shown in research to help anchor the timing of the body's internal clock, which in turn tends to support more consistent, higher quality sleep the following night. It costs nothing and requires no equipment, just proximity to a window or a few minutes outside. On napping. A short nap, generally under 30 minutes, appears in most studies to carry little downside and can genuinely restore alertness. Longer or later naps have been associated in some research with more difficulty falling asleep at night. The practical takeaway isn't to fear an occasional nap. It's to notice whether napping has quietly become a substitute for addressing poor nighttime sleep, rather than an occasional bonus on top of it. The broader goal isn't chasing a specific number of hours like a pass-fail test. It's recognizing that sleep quality, consistency, and architecture matter at least as much as raw duration, and that persistent changes in your sleep are worth raising with a healthcare provider, rather than quietly absorbing as just another unavoidable part of getting older. So here we are, at the end of one ordinary American day. A glass of water that either happened or didn't. A first meal eaten within minutes of waking, or delayed by an hour or two. An afternoon spent in real conversation, or in near total silence. A body either challenged by resistance or left undisturbed. A night spent in 7 restorative hours, or 9 restless ones. None of these 5 things, on their own, determines how long or how well you live. Biology doesn't work in tidy, isolated lines, and no single video, checklist, or supplement can responsibly promise otherwise. Genetics matter. Access to healthcare matters.
Chance plays a real role too, and always will. But what the research keeps returning to, study after study, decade after decade, is that an enormous share of how the second half of life actually feels is shaped by ordinary, repeatable, almost invisible choices made inside ordinary days that nobody ever thought to examine closely.
It's also worth being honest about why this kind of information so often fails to change behavior, even when people fully believe it. It's rarely a lack of willpower. It's that American life rarely pauses long enough to make room for it. And the healthcare system most Americans rely on is built to treat problems once they've already arrived, not to walk someone through the quiet architecture of an ordinary day. Closing that gap has less to do with motivation and more to do with structure. Attaching new habits to things that already happen automatically. A glass of water kept by the coffee maker, a resistance band left by the front door, a recurring call already sitting on the calendar, rather than relying on remembering to care. Maybe the most useful shift isn't trying to optimize every hour starting tomorrow. It's simply noticing. Noticing the moment thirst doesn't quite show up the way it used to.
Noticing how long the stretch of silence in an afternoon has really become. Noticing whether 9 hours in bed actually feels like rest or just like time passing. Because buried in all of this research isn't really a story about adding years to a life in the abstract. It's about something researchers now track as a separate measure, often called healthspan. The stretch of years actually lived with real vigor, function, and independence, rather than simply survived. That's a subtler kind of longevity than the one usually advertised, and in many ways, a far more meaningful one. None of this requires becoming a different person or turning every day into a performance of wellness. It requires something smaller and more sustainable. Treating a handful of ordinary moments, the first glass of water, the first bite, the first real conversation, the first stretch of resistance against gravity, the first hour of true darkness before sleep, as worth a little more attention than they've ever been given before. So the next time that alarm goes off and your body quietly begins making its first decision of the day before you've had a single conscious thought, will you notice?